And so let me say right at the outset that none of us have the full details on Trump's plan, obviously, or what their intentions are for the future. We don't know all of that. So we can really only comment on what's publicly known or publicly has been stated so far. But to understand this whole subject from a biblical standpoint, really we need to go back to the beginning, to God's calling of Abraham, and to understand the foundation for this and the timeless promises and principles that we still want to be aware of today, because I still believe that it's relevant today. So, Mondo, I'd love for you to just start by expanding a little bit on that and just take us through some of the scripture passages that talk about God's land promises to Israel. How did this all start? And who was it given to? What are the defined borders? And how do we really know that the land promise is still relevant to us today?
Yeah, that's a great question. It comes down certainly to the foundation of, I mean, almost all of the Bible. And what I mean by that is, when we go to Genesis 1 through 11, uh, we see it as a foundational thing for just really human history. But then at the end of chapter 11, we see God beginning to lay down some genealogies, and that genealogy comes, from Nahor, and ultimately arrives at the person of Abraham. So then in chapter 12, verse 1, we see the beginnings of God's very specific directives to this guy, Abraham. We know from Joshua chapter 24, verse 2, that he was a pagan. He was a pagan living in the land of Mesopotamia across the Euphrates River on the other side. And so, why God chose Abraham, that only God knows that. But we know that there was nothing inherently righteous about him. But God called him and said, leave your land, leave your parents, leave your father, your family, and everything. I'm going to take you to a land that I will show you. And so sure enough, he goes on a journey, and we know that he comes to the land that we understand, at least the land of Canaan, this place that we understand in modern Israel today. And God shows up in Genesis 12. We see it in 13, 15, 17, all through there, where God says to him, hey, look, I'm going to bless you. Genesis 12:3. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make you a father of many nations. And he changed his name from Abram to Abraham. And through him, all the families of the nations of the earth would be blessed. His name would be great. And we know today, at least over the last 2,000 years, Abraham is known everywhere. I mean, it's amazing. This random guy in ancient history now is so well known, certainly because of the church, because of the Christian church, and what God is doing through that. So, but what we also see is God in Genesis 12, again, 13, 15, 17, all these passages, he makes promises specifically to Abraham, these what theologians will describe as unconditional promises. Abraham, this is what I'm going to do for you. And it wasn't based on his obedience. It wasn't based on his response necessarily. It was based on God's promise. And so one of that was, look around. You see all this land? I'm going to give it to you, and I'm going to give it to your descendants. And then what we see throughout the rest of the book of Genesis, going into Isaac, we know the story of Isaac and Ishmael, and God says quite clear, Genesis 21:22, that I'm going to make the covenant that I made with you, Abraham, for all of these things is going to be given to Isaac, not Ishmael. And then we get to Jacob and Esau, and he says, I'm going to give it to Jacob. And he gives it to Jacob. And then what we see is even going later in Numbers chapter 24. So now we're several centuries later after the Exodus. They're wandering in the wilderness, and God says through Balaam the prophet, amazingly, Numbers 24:9, that there we know in Genesis 12:3, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. Well, that same phraseology is used specifically of Jacob and of Israel and the 12 tribes in Numbers 24. So it skips Ishmael, it skips Isaac, and you have these promises. Now, from those original unconditional covenant promises that God made to Abraham, we see three things that flow out of that. And one is land, which we see that in Deuteronomy 29 and 30, about the land again being promised to the people of Israel. And then we see the seed, which is ultimately the Messiah, and through David, 2 Samuel 7, we see the Davidic covenant there. And then we see the blessing where he says, Abraham, I'm going to make you a blessing into all the world. And we see that through the new covenant of Jeremiah 31. So you have in seed form, which is no surprise in the book of Genesis, this eternal covenant that God made with Abraham, and then the outflowing of those promises in three additional covenants: the land, the seed, and the blessing. So when we come to today, what I would say in closing in this section and this question is, when you go to Romans 9 and even Romans 11, we see that the writer Paul is saying that Israel, the nation of Israel, who he was a Jew, he was an Israelite, he was from Benjamin, he was a Hebrew. All the languages appears there. He says, "Look, I I love my brothers. I'm heartbroken over most of my brethren because they've rejected Jesus's message." But he said, "But to them belong the promises, the patriarchs, the covenants, the glory, the giving of the law, and those." But so let me say it this way: he's writing this around 52 A.D. or so, in the 50s, and Israel had already, as a nation, rejected Jesus. Okay, of course, the church, there were the remnant that believed on the Lord Jesus, as we know in Acts chapter 2 and on. But Paul's writing this again even after he got saved, and even in the midst of their rebellion. I mean, again, nationally they were rebelling. Individually, many were saved. But he says, to them belong. It wasn't a past tense verb. It wasn't that it did belong to them, but they've lost it now. It did belong to them, and now it's forfeited so as Paul's writing Romans 9 and 11, they're in a state of rebellion, but yet the covenants and all those blessings still existed, they still possessed it. Romans 11 is very clear. The gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. And that's Paul's whole point. And so when we come to fast forward to today, he's like, well, how does this affect me today? Well, it affects us today in our understanding theologically that even though Israel, again, is still in a state of rebellion, just like in the 50s of AD, now we're almost in the 2050. So, roughly 2,000 years, the promises still belong to them. They have never been revoked. That's what Romans 11 says. So again, rebellion in the first century, they didn't lose the promises. Rebellion currently, they still haven't lost the promises. And so that comes to play when we think about Gaza and modern Israel. And as we will discuss, modern Israel is far from perfect. That's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you see the word everlasting used all throughout. As you touched on, it's a covenant that doesn't depend on Israel doing anything good or bad. It was a unilateral covenant. And so everlasting, unilateral, I mean, it would make sense that then when we get to the New Testament, we get to Romans, we would see language like that. So it makes perfect sense to me. But what are the actual defined boundaries that we're talking about here? And I know that one of the boundaries refers to a river near Egypt, the Brook of Egypt, I think it's phrased in some translations. There's been some confusion about what this is. Does this refer to the Nile, in your opinion?
I think I took a class in seminary on historical geography with his name escapes me for the moment, but he wrote the Moody Bible Atlas, and I'm so sorry I forgot his name, but great professor. But he's one of the most well-known professors anywhere ever for historical geography, and we had a big discussion in class on that, and it's quite clear that it does not refer to the River Nile, that it refers to the brook that was well known in ancient times to be pretty much, now, again, we can't look at things in the current topography of the desert and then try to retro that back to Abraham, 4,000 years ago, because climate has changed and other things. But this is referring to the Brook of Egypt, and it's well known in all the sources that this was not referring to the Nile River. It was referring to a brook that was just south of modern day Gaza Strip, and was well known. And then if you go north, the boundaries go all the way up to Tyre and Sidon in Lebanon, and then over to the east towards the Euphrates River, which the Euphrates River is progressing at from a northwest to a southeast trajectory. And so you get to certain places out there, and it's, again, I would say, like in the country of Jordan today or east of Amman, very deserty, and hardly in the sense of in ancient times people would live there. They lived a little bit more west towards the Mediterranean Sea. But so if you go from the not the Nile, but this brook, the El Arish brook, from there up to Tyre, east to basically the Euphrates River, and then down. We also know as well that on the eastern side, that you get to like the river, you have the river Arnon and others that are making their way in towards the Dead Sea. And so when you get down towards the southeast part of the Dead Sea, you have the boundary where anything below that is considered Edom or even into Moab. And if you read Deuteronomy 1 through 3, we see that the Israelites are making their way basically up from the south, and then they come, and they don't come straight up the south, let's say like through Beersheba or any of those places. They go to the east, and they go around the Dead Sea. And as they're going around, God is describing them. Hey, look, this is the land that I gave to Moab, and this is the land I gave to Edom, and you're not getting any of it. You're not even getting an inch of it. And so they make their way around that eastern side and come up across these boundaries. And then when they get there, of course, God said, there were the Zamzumim over here, and all these kind of Nephilim tribes that God had already removed in times past. And now their job was to come and to enter into the land of Canaan and get rid of the other giant tribes and Nephilim tribes and just Canaanites. But God was going to do that. So when we come today, we know that Israel has never possessed, even under Joshua and Solomon and others, they've never possessed every last inch of the original promised land, especially towards Lebanon and Tyre and Sidon. So those boundaries today, Israel is not currently in, as we know, and I don't anticipate that they will enjoy those until the coming millennial period.
All right. So I've seen some maps of this, people trying to kind of just put it in visual form for people to understand. And they usually do go from the Nile, which I would disagree with. I would agree with you that it's the Wadi El Arish. And is that the actual dividing point? Is that like the current southern boundary point of Gaza itself? Do you know?
It's as far as I know, if it's not, it's very, very close because of all the I would say, I wouldn't say call it industrial, but because of all the man-made things there, I think that whole brook and river area is no longer around. I mean, I could be wrong on that, but as I've looked, I haven't seen necessarily like, oh wow, there's a river that comes down here and it's still able to exist. Now the Wadi probably is still there, but that's my understanding. So as much as I want to say I know for sure, I haven't looked at it recently to remember.
Yeah. And then when you look at some of these maps that people draw, they kind of maybe take some liberties where they go from, I guess, what would be the southernmost boundary, like the Negev or the top of the Red Sea.
Yes, now that's true because we
Okay.
know Elat is there. I've been to Elat many times, and it does. It looks like this V where
Right,
it
right.
comes down, and you have the Arava Valley, which extends from pretty much the Red Sea going right up into through the Dead Sea. I mean, the Dead Sea is the lowest place on earth, and so that really was one of the main boundaries there. But is under the time of Solomon, he had ships going out from the Red Sea area down at Elat. So Elat is well known. Israel is well known down there. But again, when you go east of the Arava, that valley, you start getting into Edom, and that's where
Right.
God says, "Nope, that's not
Yeah,
yours." And
and
so
that's what I
Edom
was going
and
to say is that some people start at the southernmost boundary I've seen on these maps and they go all the way across to almost where because they're taking the Euphrates as the easternmost boundary and they're seeing it as, well, you just follow the entire length of the
yeah,
Euphrates almost all the way down to ancient Sumer, I guess, where that
yeah,
would
no,
have been. Yeah.
that would be. I mean, I would be curious to see who does that. But what I in my studies with looking at again historical geography, and I have many atlases. I have a lot of historical atlases, and I've never seen any of them go and follow that all the way, like you said, all the way over to Iraq. It's just at that northeastern section, Hamath and other places in ancient times, and no doubt Solomon and David were up there in the land of the Arameans. they definitely were in that area, which again borders. So the northeastern corner, it borders the Euphrates River, but it's more like a straight down from there. Again, because we know that when you get to those other sections, that was Edom, and God said, no, that's not yours at all. And so you have to put a boundary there. And if you look at, Reuben and the other tribes that were on the east side, they don't go all the way over there either.
So it's basically the easternmost boundary is sort of the Jordan River or a little bit over it, would be your understanding?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it is no, they actually go east of the Jordan River quite a bit, but really where in modern times you would say that like Amman, Jordan. So what you have there, if you were to go just to the north part of the Dead Sea and then draw a line, I mean, if people look and go to the north, go this way to the east, and then up, because the land of Bashan, that was all northeast, the Golan Heights that we understand today, that was all Israel. But again, when you have a river boundary there, and then everything south of that and east is Edom, and so they would not go any further than there. But on the west side of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea, down into the Negev, that's the tribe of Judah. So the tribe of Judah extends far more south from a latitudinal idea than the east side.
Hmm.
And so it kind of blends. If we're going from here, it blends like this up towards Mount Hermon and up to the Euphrates River, and then even to the north, like even some of the northern mountains of Galilee today.
And so even some parts of Syria then would be considered within this. So Damascus would
100%.
fall within this.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I would say most of like Damascus and other things, most of that in ancient times for sure. David, Solomon for